test, one, two. Test, one, two.
Check, check. Check, check.
Good afternoon. What? Is this working? Hello? Not yet, at least. So, yes. She said she would be. Excellent. Hello? But how do you get this to work? Excellencies, colleagues, I'm not sure this is working. You sure? You sure? Can anybody hear me in the room? Not really. No. So, hmm? Excellencies, colleagues, we should settle down, find the seats, get going. It's a pleasure to see you all. My speaking notes say good morning, but we're already at good afternoon, everybody. Just to say this at the beginning, we're running late quite a bit, and that will play out a little bit in the schedule of how we do things. But I would like to hand over first to my co-chair, our dear colleague from Qatar.
Excellencies.
And could we have a bit quiet in the room, please, to get started? Thank you.
Excellencies and distinguished delegates, good morning. On behalf of my co-chair, His Excellency Mr. Reclef Boughton, Permanent Representative of Germany to the United Nations, and on my own behalf, it is my honor and privilege to welcome you all to Session 1 of the 2026 High-Level Conference of Heads of Counterterrorism Agencies of Member States. A warm welcome to our special guests, our civil society representatives, and our distinguished panelists, to representatives of member states, to our colleagues from international and regional organizations, and to all other civil society representatives joining us today. This session, dedicated to addressing terrorism in conflict-affected and high-risk contexts, speaks to one of the most pressing and enduring dimensions of our collective counterterrorism challenge. Armed conflict and fragility continue to provide fertile ground for terrorist groups to recruit, finance, and operate. Meeting this challenge requires not only strong national responses, but coherent, integrated, and human rights compliant approaches at the international level. We look forward to a rich and substantive discussion. Before we proceed to our speakers, my co-chair and I will each deliver brief remarks in our national capacities. أصحاب السعادة السيدات والسادة.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I would like to thank the UNOCT for organizing this conference. It's a pleasure to chair this meeting with the representative of Germany. This roundtable addressing terrorism in conflict-affected and high-risk contexts. This is a priority area at the international level in which we need to address the high-risk and conflict-based settings. Indeed, conflict settings where we see humanitarian crises, poverty, and displacement offer fertile ground for terrorism and for terrorist groups to gain in strength as they recruit civilians to carry out terrorist attacks and target vital infrastructure. The state of Qatar has reaffirmed the importance of ensuring an inclusive, comprehensive approach in counterterrorism. It's important to address the underlying causes of terrorism while respecting diversity and dialogue. On this basis, we continue with our national and international efforts. At the country level, we have taken a comprehensive approach. We have ensured multi-stakeholder cooperation through the Global Counter-Terrorism Bureau. We have a strategy to counter violent extremism and terrorism. The state of Qatar is continuing its efforts to strengthen peace and security in our region and the world. We provide aid in terms of development and humanitarian aid to strengthen development and also to allow states to focus on counterterrorism through our work with the UNOCT. We are one of the donor countries to the office, and we have done since it was established. And likewise, Doha hosts the Counterterrorism Office, focusing on high-risk contexts. We look at the socio-economic effects of terrorism, etc. In high-risk contexts, ladies and gentlemen, it's important to strengthen prevention and focus on societal efforts. We need to ensure cooperation between civil society, the government, and while also upholding the prerogatives of each stakeholder. The Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy is the suitable framework for counterterrorism. It's important to implement the 4 pillars, particularly in high-risk contexts, in human rights, security, and other areas. It's also important to ensure that counterterrorism in conflict areas is based on the principles of the Charter and human rights. To conclude, we reaffirm our readiness to cooperate with all member states to generate an environment free of terrorism, and we hope that this conference is a great success. Thank you very much.
Floor to my dear colleague, Ambassador Mr. Bhutan.
Thank you so much, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. I'm happy to be here and have the opportunity to address this conference. I'll try to be brief with my remarks. Armed conflict, humanitarian crises, and political instability remain among the most significant drivers of terrorism. This session, dedicated to addressing terrorism in conflict-affected and high-risk contexts, therefore focuses on a central dimension of our collective counterterrorism efforts. We are witnessing, everybody knows, the continued expansion and adaptation of terrorist groups, including Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, and ISIL-Daesh affiliates, such as the Islamic State Sahel province. These groups are refining their tactics, including the increased use of improvised explosive devices, kidnappings, arson attacks, hit-and-run operations involving drones and mortars. They're also making growing use of digital platforms for propaganda, for recruitment, and for coordination. This evolving threat landscape requires a shift from primarily reactive responses towards anticipatory preparedness. Effective counterterrorism requires a comprehensive approach, demands a deeper understanding of the links between instability, governance gaps, socioeconomic vulnerabilities, and drivers of violent extremism. It also requires addressing the nexus between terrorism and organized crime, as both often rely on overlapping financial flows, smuggling routes, and networks. Countering terrorist financing is critical to disrupting operational capabilities at their source and requires sustained coordination among national authorities, regional organizations, international partners, and civil society. And in this regard, I would like to briefly focus on West Africa, which continues to be particularly affected by terrorism. And as co-chair of the West Africa Working Group alongside Algeria, since 2019, Germany has supported practical, needs-based solutions developed in close cooperation with the countries in the region. Our priorities include capacity building in the areas of counter-terrorist financing, addressing the improvised explosive device threat, as reflected in the Lomé recommendations, and strengthening border security management through mechanisms such as the integrated border stability mechanisms. Implemented in partnership with UNODC, our approach is firmly grounded in the rule of law, respect for human rights, while strengthening criminal justice responsive. At the same time, we recognize that prevention extends beyond security measures alone. Deterrence is not sufficient. Effective prevention must also address the narratives that drive recruitment and ensure that individuals vulnerable to radicalization are offered credible alternatives and opportunities. So building resilience requires empowering local communities, strengthening national ownership, and fostering cross-sectoral cooperation. And this includes targeted training for law enforcement and counterterrorism practitioners. The exchange of good practices is a key element of preparedness. The West Africa Working Group provides an important platform in this regard, bringing together experts from across the region and beyond, and its technical and non-political nature has helped sustain dialogue even during periods of political tension. Rest assured, Germany remains firmly engaged also in West Africa, with a particular focus on preventing spillover effects from the Sahel to the coastal states. We therefore continue to support comprehensive regional security architecture through mechanisms and initiatives like the Coastal States Stability Mechanism, Integrated Border Stability Mechanism, and the GCTF Working Group, as well as the Northwest Prevention Facility. We firmly believe that investing in resilience offers the most sustainable approach to countering terrorism, and we're ready to continue supporting states in building their capacity to manage risk, anticipate future threats, and ensure the safety and security of their citizens. Thank you very much for your attention to my remarks.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We will now turn to our special guests for their interventions. Due to the time constraints, if we can limit the interventions to no more than 5 minutes, so we can ensure that all the guest speakers have their time. It is my pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Elisa Dianda Madrazo, President of the Financial Action Task Force.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Can you hear me? Is it on? Thank you for the invitation. Is it on? Yep. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. The Financial Action Task Force and its global network comprises over 200 jurisdictions, supporting all of them in fighting terrorism and, in particular, terrorist financing. We do our support in two ways. First, we help the jurisdictions identify their strengths, but also their shortcomings in their systems to improve their AML CFT regime. And secondly, we help the jurisdictions develop a set of tools to combat financing of terrorism and to do it under two principles. The first one, the risk-based approach, and the second one, proportionality. We do our work on regular basis with synergies with other stakeholders, international organizations such as the United Nations, other international partners, but also we include, importantly, the private sector and social and civil society. We do this to make sure that the ecosystem works together, but also to leverage each other's expertise. This collaboration is shown very clearly in two reports that we issued recently. The first one in 2025, we issued the comprehensive update on terrorist financing, in which CITED played a leadership role. And the second one that we published just last Friday, it's a report on terrorist financing through social media and messaging applications. Both reports show a key finding. Countries affected by armed conflict and exposed to high terrorism risk face a more complex and a heightened threat, which is fueled by several aspects. One is informality. Second one is the limited oversight and institutional capacity, and in some cases, the lack of trust in their financial system. The data tells a stark story. In 2024, 98% of the deaths of terrorism occurred in a conflict-affected country. This shows that, as we have been discussing, prolonged instability and weakened institutions sustain terrorism, but also it is a reminder that they create the conditions for financing of terrorism to persist and to evolve, which of course has far-reaching implications for the international peace and security. With regards to funding of terrorism, we continue to see the exploitation of humanitarian channels, taking advantage of the crisis for raising funds. And they can misuse legitimate non-profit organizations to channel funds under the cover of aid in crisis zones. This highlights a critical challenge to safeguard these channels, but also to make sure that they're not used by terrorists who are quickly adapting and exploiting vulnerabilities. Terrorists are also creating revenue by conducting other crimes. In particular, we see illicit arms trade, humanitarian traffic, and ransom. We also see the use of crowdfunding platforms, and we see that they're using more resilient and technologically enabled terrorist financing models, such as money and value transfer services, small money service business, and crypto, including stable coins, which of course are difficult to detect and even more so in conflicted areas. In the face of this terrorist financing challenge, and they becoming more adaptive, more networked, and more highly exploitative of humanitarian challenge, we're working to strengthen international cooperation and enhance the detection capabilities, and that information being shared, that intelligence information being shared across governments and agencies also with the private sector. Our efforts of engagement go beyond traditional stakeholders. We're working with actors from social media platforms, from crowdfunding services, and other digital intermediates now on the front line that have a critical role to play in identifying and disrupting these flows. We must harness the expertise together. In line with the mandate of the FATF, which is combating terrorist financing, we will continue to focus on emerging risks so that as global community we can take action. This was agreed by our ministers in the ministerial meeting of the FATF in April, but also in the ministerial conference No Money for Terror that was hosted by President Macron just in May of this year, where it was highlighted the significant risk of emerging technologies and of virtual assets that are enabling terrorist financing. And this is an area that the FATF will continue to focus. My last message to this room, and I think it's probably the most important one, is that we know the challenge that low capacity jurisdictions have, and also affected and conflicting areas. And the commitment of the FATF is to work with all jurisdictions and support all of them in this endeavor to manage and mitigate the risk of terrorist financing. I thank you for the invitation.
I thank Ms. Dia and Mendoza for her valuable remarks.
I would now like to Ms. Mira Kusumarini, founder and director of CSAFE Empatiku Foundation of Indonesia, to take the floor as a voice from civil society.
Your Excellencies, Co-Chair Excellencies, the permanent representatives of the State of Qatar and Germany to the United Nations, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mira Kusumarini, founder and director of Empatiku Foundation of Indonesia. It is an honor to bring the voice of civil society to this session, and I'm grateful to the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism for this opportunity. In conflict-affected and fragile environments, governance gaps and socio-economic vulnerabilities may create fertile ground for terrorism to take root and spread. But vulnerability to violent extremism does not require active conflict. In Indonesia, as many stable but at-risk societies, the important role of local communities in mobilizing grassroots responses to prevent violent extremism has long been underestimated. Community groups remain fragmented. Their collective capacity to detect early warning signs and respond constructively is still largely untapped. This is why whole of government and whole of society approaches are not optional. They are essential. Our answers has been the community-based early warning and early response system, a model built on 4 integrated pillars that bring together government, civil society, communities, and families around a common purpose. First, public education to help citizens recognize and counter violent extremist narratives. Second, case management to handle early intervention and social reintegration. Third, community social cohesion to strengthen the bonds that make societies resistant to radicalization to terrorism. And fourth, policy support to embedded these efforts in durable legal and institutional framework. Community-based early warning and early response system is not a civil society initiative in isolation. It operates through active coordination across all levels of government, from the village to the provincial, and with the police, ministries, and religious institutions. This is whole of government and whole of society in practice. This model does not stop at Indonesia's borders. In partnership with United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, we have replicated it in the Maldives, focusing on preventing youth radicalization to terrorism. And our work fits into the Southeast Asia Network on preventing and countering violent extremism, developed jointly by UNODC and Southeast Asia member states, which brings together policymakers, practitioners, civil society, and community leaders to translate national strategies into locally grounded action. This is regional whole of a society cooperation in practice. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the lessons from Indonesia and from the region is clear. Security alone cannot build resilience. We need integrated, context-specific responses that place communities at the center. And the investment pays back. What begins as a prevention program becomes over time a foundation of social trust, and no terrorist narrative can easily erode. And the investment, we urge member states and the United Nations to invest in and scale these approaches, because a world free from terrorism is a collective responsibility and a collective achievement. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Kusumarini for joining us today and for sharing her important perspective. We will now turn to our distinguished panelists, and I invite His Excellency Mr. Zenon Gai Mukongo, Permanent Representative of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to take the floor. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Monsieur le modérateur,
Distinguished moderator, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me on behalf of the DRC to thank the UN for convening this important panel on combating terrorism in the context of conflict in high-risk situations. The experience of various regions in the world demonstrates that terrorism prospers where armed conflict persists, where institutions are fragile, and where people are living in poverty. This reality is especially clear in the Sahel, the Lake Chad Basin, the Greater Horn of Africa, certain parts of the Middle East, in Asia, as well as in Haiti, where armed violence and organized crime, as well as the collapse of the state's authority, have created an environment that favors the expansion of terrorist groups and criminal networks. The DRC, unfortunately, has been aware of this and living this reality for several decades. In the east of the DRC, the abuses committed by terrorists affiliated with ISIS continue to involve civilian massacres, sexual violence, forced recruitment of children, mass displacement of populations, as well as destruction of economic and social infrastructure. These actions severely jeopardize peace, development, and national cohesion. To address this threat, we are convinced that a military response, although indispensable, will not be sufficient to guarantee lasting peace. Resolution 73/2001 recalls the need for strengthening international cooperation to combat terrorism, and the UN's Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy insists on the need to address the root causes of the spread of terrorism. Resolution 2462 of 2019 highlights that curbing financing sources for terrorism remains a key element of any effective strategy. In this regard, we believe that three priorities deserve particular attention. First of all, strengthening international solidarity to allow states dealing with terrorism to have sufficient capacity when it comes to training, border control, criminal justice, as well as combating financing of terrorism and protecting civilian populations. Secondly, access to justice and combating impunity are at the heart of the international response. Perpetrators of terrorist attacks and those who finance, arm, or facilitate their activities ought to be held responsible for their actions before international law. In parallel, victims ought to receive recognition and support. We need to have effective reparations mechanisms. Therefore, Resolution 1566 of 2004 recalls the need for supporting and assisting victims of terrorism. Thirdly, we need to further invest in prevention by simultaneously addressing the factors that fuel conflict and foster terrorism. These include poverty, inequality, poor governance, illicit resource exploitation, illicit financial flows, as well as the misuse of digital technologies for terrorist purposes. Mr. Moderator, terrorism is now a common threat that knows no borders, no continents or cultures. No state can deal with this single-handedly. The DRC remains convinced that international solidarity, justice, reparations for victims, sustainable development, and respect for international law represent the essential foundations for building a future without terrorism, which our people aspire to. Thank you.
I invite His Excellency Mr. Luqman Al-Faili, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Iraq to the United Nations, to take the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, allow me at the outset to express Iraq's appreciation to the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism and the co-chairs of this session for convening this important discussion on addressing terrorism in conflict-affected and high-risk contexts. This conference assumes particular significance as it takes place alongside the 9th review of the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, at a time when terrorist threats continue to evolve, exploit instability, and adapt to challenging geopolitical realities. It provides an important opportunity to assess progress, exchange experiences, and reaffirm our collective commitment to the comprehensive and effective approach to counter-terrorism. As a country that has endured the devastating consequences of terrorism and armed conflict, Iraq has accumulated valuable experiences in confronting these challenges. Our experience has demonstrated that military victories alone are not sufficient. Sustainable success requires a comprehensive approach that combines security measures with accountability, rehabilitation, reintegration, institution building, and international cooperation. Following the territorial defeat of Daesh ISIS, Iraq has remained at the forefront of effort to address the complex legacy of terrorism. This includes managing one of the most challenging international security files related to campus and detention facilities in northeast Syria. Iraq has assumed primary responsibility in addressing this issue, and to date, more than 5,700 terrorists of various nationalities have been transferred to Iraq, in coordination with the Global Coalition to Defeat Daesh and the United States Central Command, with the objective of reducing security risk and preventing terrorism regrouping. At the same time, Iraq has undertaken significant effort to facilitate the return, rehabilitation, and reintegration of Iraqi nationals from Al-Hol and surrounding camps. These efforts have included rehabilitation program, psychological support, community-based reintegration initiative, and measures aimed at preventing radicalization and reducing the risk of recidivism. The majority of detainees have successfully reintegrated into their communities, demonstrating the importance of adopting balanced and sustainable approach that address both security and humanitarian considerations. Excellencies, distinguished guests, the Iraqi experience has highlighted several important lessons for addressing terrorism in conflict-affected and high-risk environments. First, national ownership remains indispensable. Sustainable solutions can only be achieved when affected states lead efforts in accordance with their national priorities and circumstances. Second, international burden sharing is essential. The challenges posed by terrorism, including those related to foreign terrorist fighters and their family members, can't be addressed by frontline states alone. Greater international cooperation and shared responsibility remain critical to achieving lasting results. Third, accountability must remain a cornerstone of counterterrorism efforts. Prosecution, rehabilitation, reintegration should be pursued as complementary and mutually reinforced components of a comprehensive response. Fourth, preventing terrorism requires addressing the conditions conducive to spread, including instability, weak institutions, and the exploitation of vulnerable communities by terrorist organizations. In this regard, Iraq has greatly values its partnership with the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism and of other United Nations entities. We welcome the establishment of UNOCT program office in Baghdad and remain committed to supporting its work. Iraq has contributed more than $3.5 million to support UNOCT programs, reflecting our commitment to strengthen international cooperation in this field. We also appreciate the support provided by UNOCT in capacity building initiatives, including programs related to human rights, rehabilitation, and prevention in conflict zones. Iraq further looks forward to co-organizing with UNOCT at the United Nations Conference to enhance international support for victims of terrorism in Baghdad, underscoring our shared commitment to placing victims at the center of our collective efforts. Excellencies, terrorism remains one of the most serious threats to international peace and security. The Iraqi experience demonstrates that progress is possible when national determinations is matched by effective international cooperation and sustained multilateral engagement. The lessons learned from conflict-affected and high-risk contexts should inform the implementation of the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy and strengthen our collective capacity to address evolving and engaging terrorist threats. Finally, Iraq remains firmly committed to working with all partners to advance the objectives of the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Strategy and to contribute to the future free of the world from terrorism. Thank you, sir.
I thank the permanent representative of Iraq for his remarks, and I now give the floor to Ms. Elizabeth Beha, Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding and Peace Support of the Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, co-chairs. It's really a pleasure to be participating in this panel this afternoon. I also think it's relevant and useful that this counterterrorism week is following on the heels of the first ever peacebuilding week that we commemorated just a few days ago. The interlinkages between peacebuilding and counterterrorism, I think, are increasingly clear. Strengthening governance, rule of law, and social cohesion not only help to prevent conflict, but they also reduce the conditions that terrorist groups exploit. So in this context, I would like to echo and reinforce three cardinal points. First of all, evidence has shown that terrorism in fragile settings cannot be addressed solely through securitized approaches. In many of the fragile contexts where the UN is engaged, terrorism flourishes when conflict, exclusion, weak governance, lack of economic opportunities, and unresolved grievances intersect. Security responses are indispensable to protect populations and contain immediate threats, but experience consistently shows that on their own, they cannot eliminate the conditions that allow terrorism and violent extremism to endure. That's where peacebuilding becomes an essential complement, as experience shows that counterterrorism efforts and measures against violent extremism will fall short if they are not part and parcel of broader efforts to build and sustain peace. Recent global trends remind us of this reality. While overall terrorism deaths have declined globally, parts of the Sahel and other conflict-affected regions continue to experience high levels of terrorist violence. Indeed, deaths in the Sahel region accounted for more than half of all terrorism-related deaths globally. These environments demonstrate the close relationship between insecurity, governance deficits, institutional fragility, and violent extremism. This is why member states and the UN must continue investing in integrated approaches that combine security measures with peace-building, development, and human rights, including strong investment in institution-building efforts. Second, we need to place greater emphasis on resilience and prevention, as a number of speakers have also underscored. From a peace-building perspective, one of the most effective ways to address terrorism is to tackle the structural drivers of violence, such as inequality, exclusion, and injustice in affected societies and communities before violence takes root. It also means investing in women and young people, not merely as beneficiaries of programs, but as partners and leaders. We must work towards addressing socioeconomic grievances and preventing the recruitment of individuals into armed groups. Achieving these objectives requires ensuring provision of basic services and creating economic opportunities, which increase the opportunity costs of engaging in illicit activities. Our experience with disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration underscores this point. Too often, reintegration, the R in DDR, remains the weakest link, with insufficient investment in the long-term socioeconomic reintegration of former associates of armed and terrorist groups, and in the resilience of the communities receiving them. Without sustained support, there's a real risk of reversals and renewed recruitment into armed and terrorist groups. We've seen encouraging examples of multidimensional efforts across different contexts. Through the Peacebuilding Fund, the UN has supported women religious leaders in Mauritania who promote dialogue, tolerance, and social cohesion within their communities. In Somalia, support has been provided to reintegration, community dialogue, and youth-focused initiatives involving formerly associated al-Shabaab members and at-risk youth. These efforts demonstrate once again that prevention is most effective when it is locally grounded and community-owned. Peacebuilding and prevention, however, require sustained political commitment and long-term investment. There are no quick fixes because building resilient institutions, restoring trust, and creating economic opportunities are generational efforts, not short-term projects. Third, coherence and partnerships are essential. One of the persistent operational challenges in fragile environments is fragmentation. Too often, security actors, development actors, humanitarian actors, and peacebuilding actors operate in parallel rather than through a shared strategy. The experience of the organization suggests that the most effective responses are those that connect these different efforts around nationally identified priorities through what the Secretary General calls networked multilateralism, which I'm pleased to see will be further discussed during the next panel. This requires strong national ownership, but also meaningful participation by local authorities, civil society organizations, women's groups, youth networks, religious leaders, and communities themselves. It also requires stronger partnerships with regional organizations, international financial institutions, partner countries, including through South-South cooperation, and where appropriate, the private sector. In fact, the private sector has an increasingly important role in strengthening resilience, protecting critical infrastructure, and addressing the misuse of digital technologies by terrorist groups. For example, in PBPSO, we are increasingly partnering with development finance institutions and private investors to support peace-positive investments in fragile settings, demonstrating how responsible private capital can contribute to economic resilience, job creation, and longer-term stability alongside traditional peace-building efforts. To conclude, the challenge of terrorism in conflict-affected contexts is ultimately a challenge of sustaining peace. It requires us to move beyond responding to immediate threats and toward addressing the deeper drivers of violence and instability. Thank you.
I thank Assistant Secretary General Speha for her remarks and would now like to give the floor to the Assistant Secretary General for Youth Affairs, Mr. Philippe Pollier.
Good afternoon, delegates and colleagues. Thank you to the co-chairs, Permanent Representative of Germany and Deputy Permanent Representative of Qatar. And thank you to the colleagues in the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism for the organization of this high-level conference and for the intentional invitation to our office to join this panel and to bring a youth lens and a youth angle to this very critical discussion. Let me start and begin with a very concrete and simple point. Young people in conflict-affected and high-risk settings are not the drivers of violence. They are among their first victims and among the first actually to act, to protect, and to support their communities. And we are living in a world that looks young, especially in those contexts. Today, there are approximately 2.6 billion young people aged 15 to 35 worldwide. They represent nearly 1/3 of humanity. And most conflict-affected countries actually have very young populations. And this implies that making youth-responsive prevention is not only relevant, but it's actually essential. Conflict and violence affect young people disproportionately. According to the United Nations Refugees Agency, UNHCR, an estimated 117 million people were forcibly displaced in 2025. And children and young people actually make up a significant share of those displaced. In fragile contexts, young people face overlapping risks. This includes disruption in their education, unemployment, trauma, and definitely also exposure to recruitment by violent and extremist groups. Experience shows that response to terrorism and violent extremism cannot rely only on security measures. Sustainable prevention requires addressing the deeper drivers of exclusion, of marginalization, of discrimination, of economic insecurity, and definitely also on mistrust in institutions. And this is why the Youth, Peace and Security agenda remains so relevant when we're talking about these topics. Member states in the last 10 years have recognized the importance of youth, peace and security through 4, at least, Security Council resolutions in 2015, in 2018, in 2020, and most recently in 2025. And they were very clear, you were very clearly, about the importance that young people participate fully, equally, and safely in efforts to prevent conflict, to sustain peace, and to strengthen social cohesion. The regional consultations and the global survey conducted last year for the upcoming second independent progress study on youth, peace, and security, mandated by the Pact for the Future, which has engaged more than 7,000 young people from across 150 countries, reaffirmed a very common message across regions. Young people do not want to be treated as beneficiaries of policies designed for them. They want to be trusted as real partners when it's about designing and implementing solutions. And many of the speakers before me highlighted the importance of ownership of this process when it's about building resilient communities. So allow me to bring to the discussion today 3 concrete points from a youth lens, from the perspective of the United Nations Youth Office. First, we need to invest in meaningful youth participation. Young people need opportunities to shape the decisions that affect their lives. And this implies supporting local peace-building initiatives, national prevention strategies, and economic recovery efforts. And participation needs to move beyond consultation and into more institutionalized mechanisms to co-create the solutions and to hold also our institutions accountable to our commitments. The second, supporting youth-led initiatives and promoting local ecosystems is the only way forward for building resilience. Youth-led organizations are often among the first to respond to community tensions, to prevent hate speech, to prevent polarization, and definitely to combat misinformation. But youth organizations still face major barriers when it's about access to flexible funding or to long-term financing. Investing in youth action is not only a development imperative, it's actually a prevention imperative. Third, we need to strengthen evidence and partnerships. We need better evidence on what works, and we need also to build this in collaborative frameworks. And that is what member states actually committed to in the adopted Pact for the Future. At the United Nations Youth Office, we are advancing this vision in the Pact for the Future, working together in the UN Youth Peace and Security Secretariat, together with Elizabeth's team at the Peacebuilding and Peace Support Office and with UNFPA, so we can better provide coherent support to member states, to UN entities, and especially to work with civil society and young peace builders. If we are serious about building societies that are more resilient to terrorism and to violence, then we must create the conditions for young people to exercise their agency. And that is not only an investment in young people, it's an investment in peace. Thank you very much.
I thank ASG Pollier for his remarks. I now give the floor to Mr. Ben Sol, Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms while countering terrorism.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, as Special Rapporteur, my office constantly monitors the terrible impacts of terrorism in armed conflicts on human rights. I welcome the efforts by many states to protect the right to life, to assist victims of terrorism, to rebuild after conflict, as in Syria, Iraq, and Colombia, and to pursue comprehensive strategies, evident in my recent visits to Somalia, Benin, and Cote d'Ivoire, and my forthcoming visit to Mozambique. Regrettably, some new wars on terror have also involved grave violations of international law by some states, whose illegal violence and harm to human rights has vastly outmatched terrorists. Firstly, some governments have systematically flouted international humanitarian law, including its most basic rules on protecting civilians. Increasingly, no one is safe, including medical and humanitarian personnel, journalists, peacekeepers, and United Nations personnel. Schools, housing, banks, energy infrastructure, and even nuclear facilities have been attacked. Artificial intelligence and drones have accelerated international crimes. Some other states have been complicit in atrocities by providing arms and munitions, intelligence, funds, and political protection. Yet other states have failed to use their influence to ensure respect for humanitarian law, as through protest or sanctions. Secondly, illegal wars of aggression have been launched in the name of countering terrorism, including in Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and Venezuela, in some cases harming economies and human rights globally. The United Nations Charter's fundamental rules on peace and world order have been shattered with impunity. Illegal force has also spread in South Asia, threatening the peoples of Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan. Thirdly, a phony war on so-called narco-terrorism in the Americas has seen the United States extrajudicially serial kill hundreds of defenseless civilians on the high seas, which are also crimes under the Maritime Safety Convention. In response, the silence from most states has been deafening. There have also been unlawful killings in Venezuela and threats of force against Mexico, Colombia, and Cuba. An unjustified declaration of armed conflict in Ecuador further threatens the right to life, as does growing militarization under the shield of the Americas. International law does not enforce itself. Violations in wars on terror continue because of a climate of impunity and the endemic failure to provide justice and remedies for victims. Populists blame the United Nations for these failings, but paralysis is the fault of those permanent members of the Security Council who routinely abuse their veto to protect themselves and their allies, and whose own abuses are grave threats to international security. Other Security Council members must not acquiesce in law-breaking. Why did the Council only condemn Iran's retaliatory violations, but not the Israeli and United States aggression that started the war? Why did the Council endorse an unrealistic Gaza peace plan that does not guarantee self-determination, statehood, and accountability, undermining the International Court of Justice? The international institutions that protect human rights are also under attack, including the International Criminal Court, the Human Rights Council, my fellow UN experts, and the United Nations Relief Works for weapons, while the United Nations is crippled by a liquidity crisis. Some counterterrorism laws have also targeted impartial humanitarian relief and human rights advocacy in armed conflict, undermining humanitarian law further. The latest wave of militarized wars on terror further marginalizes pillars 1 and 4 of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, precisely reinforcing the grievances that give birth to terrorism and condemning us to an endless cycle of vengeance and violence. In closing, I urge states not to tolerate resurgent, abusive wars on terror, condemn and shame lawbreakers, impose real political costs, speak up for victims, defend the institutions of international justice, demand more from Security Council members and insist on Council reform, and above all, tackle the causes of violence by funding human rights, peacemaking and peace building, development, and political inclusion. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Sol for his remarks. I now give the floor to Mr. Papasek, Acting Deputy Director of the Policy, Program, and Intergovernmental Division, United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and Empowerment of Women.
Thank you. Dear co-chairs, excellencies, distinguished panelists, colleagues, it is a pleasure to join you today for this important discussion. In 2025 and 2026, the world witnessed levels of conflict not seen since the period following the Second World War. Hence, identifying pathways to achieve sustainable peace and end cycles of violence has become more urgent than ever. As UN Women's Executive Director recently noted in her statement before the Security Council, gender equality and women's empowerment are amongst the most powerful and proven approaches to achieving peace. This understanding is grounded in decades of evidence, empirical research, and lessons learned since the adoption of Security Council 1325 on women, peace, and security. Women's rights and women's meaningful participation in decision-making are not peripheral considerations. They are fundamental requirements for building legitimate and sustainable pathways out of conflict, enabling successful early recovery, prevention, and laying the foundation for lasting peace. Despite progress, the integration of women, peace, and security commitments within counterterrorism frameworks remains limited, uneven, and at times insufficiently institutionalized. At the same time, women and girls continue to be deliberately targeted by terrorist groups. They are subjected to sexual and gender-based violence, systematically excluded from public life, denied education and access to basic services, restricted in their mobility, and deprived of opportunities and resources. The consequences of conflict and terrorist violence also extend beyond direct victimization. Violence affecting men and communities often results in increasing numbers of women-headed households, placing additional economic, social, and security burdens on women and girls. Nevertheless, these realities are not yet consistently reflected in counterterrorism responses, nor do existing approaches always deliver effectively for women, young women, and minorities. This is further reflected in persistent gaps in dedicated financing for gender-responsive assistance. Ladies and gentlemen, addressing terrorism in this context can only be legitimate and effective when responses uphold women's rights, recognize the interconnected drivers of insecurity, and place justice, prevention, and protection at the center. Experience has shown that security-focused responses alone are insufficient and may at times produce unintended adverse consequences. Strengthening the humanitarian development peace nexus is therefore more urgent than ever. Responses must address immediate needs while also contributing to long-term inclusive peace and security structures that respond to people's lived realities. Excellencies, last week, during the first annual Peace Building Week, we heard powerful examples of the work led by women peace builders across settings impacted by terrorism and conflict. Effective responses to terrorism must recognize, support, and leverage the contribution of these women peace builders at the local level. This requires steady political will, stronger partnerships, and deeper engagement between institutions and women-led civil society organizations that is grounded in trust and mutual respect. This is why UN Women's deep engagement in this area is so important. UN Women continues to work in contexts impacted by terrorism in close partnership with national institutions and women-led civil society to remove barriers to women's participation in decision-making and to increase women's representation in national security mechanisms and institutions. UN Women, therefore, remains fully committed to supporting member states and in close partnership with the UN Office of Counterterrorism in advancing gender-responsive implementation of the counterterrorism strategy and in advancing the women, peace, and security agenda within the UN counterterrorism framework. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Sack and all the other panelists for their excellent contributions to this session. We would now like to open the floor for observations, remarks, and questions. Since we started the session about 40 minutes late, we're in a bit of a predicament. We're almost at the end of the session at 1 o'clock. We are in a bind, not only because of nutrition needs of delegates, but also because of the availability of translation. We can, at the very latest, go until 1:15. So my suggestion would be that from the very long speakers list, we try to get as many speakers into this meeting as possible and move the other speakers to the next and following sessions this afternoon. First on my list for contributions is the representative of Angola, and I see the permanent representative. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Chairs, Excellencies, Angola thanks the co-chairs for convening this session, and we will thank the panelists for their insightful presentations. Terrorism continues to evolve in scale, complexity, and geographical reach. In Africa, the expansion of terrorist activity across the Sahel, the persistence of violent extremist groups in Great Lakes and Horn of Africa, and the growing risk of their spread towards the Gulf of Guinea underscore the urgent need for coordinated, preventive, and sustained action. The links between terrorism, transnational organized crime, illicit trafficking, and maritime insecurity require comprehensive response based on strong international cooperation. Angola's experience demonstrates that sustainable peace cannot be achieved through security measures alone. Following decades of armed conflict, our country has learned that strengthening state institutions, advancing national reconciliation, promoting inclusive governance, and expanding economic opportunities are essential to preventing terrorism and violent extremism. Addressing the root cause of radicalization, including poverty, exclusion, weak governance, and limited opportunities for young people, must remain central to our collective efforts. At the national level, Angola has strengthened its legal and institutional framework to combat terrorism and its financing by aligning its legislation with international standards, reinforcing the role of the Financial Intelligence Unit, and enhancing cooperation through regional evaluation mechanisms. Within the framework of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, Angola proposed 3 priority actions. First, strengthen international cooperation to prevent the misuse of emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence and unmanned systems by terrorist groups. Second, expand predictable, sustainable, and adequately funded capacity-building programs through UN Counter-Terrorism Center and the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, with particular emphasis on conflict-affected and high-risk African countries. Third, reinforce technical assistance to strengthen national capacities to combat the financing of terrorism, enhance financial intelligence, improve border management, and facilitate the recovery of illicit assets. Excellencies, counterterrorism must remain fully consistent with international law, including international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and refugee law. Women and young people must be recognized as essential partners in preventing violent extremism and building resilient communities. Finally, Angola reaffirms its unwavering commitment to multilateral cooperation and to the full, balanced, and effective implementation of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Angola for a statement, and I would now like to give the floor to the Deputy Director of the National Security Service of Armenia.
Thank you. Уважаемый господин председатель, уважаемые...
Distinguished chair, distinguished delegates, the relevant authorities in Armenia would like to thank the UNOCT for giving us the opportunity to exchange views on this at this very important platform. We're prepared to support international initiatives through joint efforts to fight terrorism and extremism. Armenia strongly condemns terrorism, which is one of the most serious threats to international peace, and we're entirely committed to the international fight against terrorism. In this regard, we have joined a number of international documents and have also joined many international counterterrorism conventions. We'd like to note that we actively participate in the work of various working groups established under the committees of the Council of Europe for Counterterrorism. The goal there is to develop appropriate and practical instruments for soft power, such as recommendations. In the latest adoption by member states of measures for counterterrorism, this was a successful effort. Armenia also supports the global convention, a coalition to defeat ISIS, and contributed to that effort, as well as other international efforts to combat terrorism. This demonstrates our resolve to weaken the capacity of ISIS. Terrorism and transnational organized crime remain one of the most significant threats to security, socioeconomic development, and human rights. The API and PNR systems for information about passengers and registration data are key instruments in strengthening national security, ensuring aviation security, and protecting state borders. Currently, Armenia is carrying out work to improve and finalize interstate agreements and memoranda of understanding between the UN and Armenia on the Go Travel system, which is a software needed to introduce API and PNR systems. We would like here to thank our colleagues from the UNOCT and express our certainty that this process will soon be finalized. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Armenia, and I would now like to turn the floor to the Security Policy Director of Cyprus.
Co-chairs, panelists, excellencies. I would like to thank the organizers for convening this important discussion as part of the 4th United Nations High-Level Conference on Counterterrorism. Terrorism, a non-conflict and increasingly interconnected challenges. Conflict-affected and high-risk contexts continue to provide fertile ground for terrorist groups to exploit instability, weak governance, humanitarian crises, and security vacuums. These conditions enable terrorist organizations to recruit, mobilize, access resources, and expand their operations, often with consequences that extend far beyond national borders. Cyprus is deeply concerned by the continued presence and resilience of terrorist groups in conflict zones and fragile regions. Recent developments in various parts of the world demonstrate that terrorism remains a significant threat to international peace and security and continues to undermine efforts towards stability, recovery, and sustainable development. Addressing terrorism in this context requires comprehensive, coordinated, and sustained responses. Security measures alone cannot fully address the challenge. Effective counter-terrorism strategies must also strengthen governance, support the rule of law, protect human rights, and address conditions conducive to terrorism while ensuring respect for international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. Particular attention should be given to the risk arising from protracted conflicts, including the movement of foreign terrorist fighters, the proliferation of weapons, terrorist access to illicit financing, and the exploitation of vulnerable populations. Terrorist groups increasingly seek to capitalize on political instability, displacement, and social fragmentation to advance their agendas. The missiles of emerging technologies further compounds these challenges. Terrorist actors continue to exploit digital platforms, encrypted communications, artificial intelligence, and other technological tools to disseminate propaganda, recruit followers, raise funds, and facilitate operational activities across borders. Addressing these evolving threats requires enhanced international cooperation and innovative policy responses that preserve fundamental rights and freedoms. As a member state of the European Union, Cyprus actively contributes to collective efforts to counter terrorism and prevent violent extremism conducive to terrorism. International cooperation, information sharing, judicial cooperation, border security, and counter-terrorism financing measures remain essential components of an effective response, particularly in regions affected by conflict and instability. In its capacity as Presidency of the Council of the European Union Working Party on Terrorism, Cyprus is committed to advancing strategic dialogue and policy coordination among EU member states on emerging terrorist threats and responses. We attach particular importance to strengthening cooperation with international partners and supporting coordinated approaches to address the evolving challenges emanating from conflict-affected and high-risk environments. Situated at the crossroads of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, Cyprus is actually aware of the transnational nature of contemporary terrorist threats and the security implications of regional instability. This reinforces our conviction that terrorism cannot be effectively addressed by any state acting alone. Multilateral cooperation, shared responsibility, and strong international partnerships remain indispensable. Excellencies, the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, together with the ongoing negotiations on its 9th review, offers some timely opportunities to strengthen our collective commitment to multilateral cooperation and to ensure that the strategy remains responsive to evolving terrorist threats. Particular attention must be paid to the continuing expansion of terrorist threats in conflict-affected regions, especially where weak governance, prolonged instability, displacement, and humanitarian crisis create opportunities for terrorist groups to operate and recruit. These developments underscore the need for sustained international engagement, capacity building, and support for affected states. Cyprus remains firmly committed to working with the United Nations, the European Union, and all international partners to advance a comprehensive, balanced, and human rights-based approach to counterterrorism and preventing violent extremism conducive to terrorism. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Cyprus. I now give the floor to Mr. M. Mahmoud Zouda, head of the Unified Information Center for the Prevention of Extremism, Terrorism, and Cybercrime of the Prosecutor General's Office from Tajikistan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to express our sincere appreciation to the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism for convening this important conference. The topic of today's session is of particular importance. According to the Global Terrorism Index 2026, 99% of all terrorism-related deaths occur in countries affected by armed conflict. Terrorism not only exploits conflict, it also fuels and prolongs it. For the Republic of Tajikistan, the issue is particularly relevant. Our country shares more than 1,400 kilometers of border with Afghanistan and remains on the front line of efforts to address the terrorist threats. Therefore, we regard security not as a purely national responsibility, but as a shared responsibility of the international community. Over the past decade, Tajikistan has established a comprehensive national framework for countering terrorism and extremism. In February this year, the government adopted its third strategy on prevention of extremism and terrorism for 2026-2040, developed in close cooperation with the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism, CTED, UNDP, UNODC, and other partners. Our approach goes beyond traditional law enforcement measures. It focuses on addressing the root causes of radicalization through prevention, community engagement, countering the misuse of internet and artificial intelligence for terrorist purposes, and combating the financing of terrorism. Humanitarian efforts also remain an important component of our work. Since 2019, Tajikistan has conducted 4 humanitarian repatriation operations, returning 382 women and children from conflict zones. Today, they benefit from comprehensive programs for medical, psychological, and social rehabilitation. We firmly believe that no nation strategically can succeed without effective regional cooperation. This is why Tajikistan continues to advance the Dushanbe process on countering terrorism and its financing, which has become a recognized international platform for dialogue, the exchange of best practices, and strengthening cooperation in countering terrorism. We also welcome the establishment of Counter-Terrorism Early Warning Network for Central Asia and actively support this work. In this stage, I would like to highlight that on June 25, 2026, just a few days before this conference, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the resolution proclaiming 2027-2036 as an international decade for strengthening peace for future generations, an initiative proposed by the President of the Republic of Tajikistan, His Excellency Emomali Rahman. Next year, on the eve of 13th anniversary of National Unity Day of Tajikistan, we, in cooperation with the United Nations and partner states, intend to hold a high-level international conference to launch the implementation of the International Decade of Strengthening of Peace for Future Generations in Dushanbe, Tajikistan. At the same time, I would like to inform that the next high-level conference within the framework of the Dushanbe process on countering terrorism and its financing is also planned to be held in Dushanbe next year. Ladies and gentlemen, the Republic of Tajikistan remains ready to share its experience, deepen partnership, and continue contribution to our common efforts towards a safer and more secure world. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tajikistan. Unfortunately, we're not able to accommodate the rest of the list of speakers, but they will be accommodated in the following sessions. I would like to thank all panelists and special guests for their insightful contributions, and all delegations for their active engagement in today's discussions. This session has shed important light on the particular challenges of addressing terrorism in conflict-affected and high-risk environments, and on the importance of principled, coordinated, and human rights compliant approaches to meeting them. The perspectives shared today from member states, international organizations, civil society, and individual experts will inform our ongoing deliberations as we look ahead to the 9th review of the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy. Session 1 of the high-level conference is adjourned.
you.